Stuck between helping the crying boys and leaving for his last trip of the night, the kind man took a deep breath and approached the distressed children. They were crying profusely, and he had no idea what to do. He knew his manager would have his hide for this, but the desperation to help proved too much. Being reliable and dependable proved to be Tim Watson's greatest pride as a bus driver, and having driven at the same time on the same route for the past few years made his track record spotless. Ensuring his passengers had a pleasant and enjoyable experience was of the utmost importance for the small town Midwestern bus driver, so much so that he was a popular name and mention in the small town of Hazy View, Boston. In his 38 years on this earth, Tim had always aimed to go the extra mile. This was evident every time he greeted his customers, each of them by name, and they greeted him equally as familiar. To remember the names of different passengers on his route between the city, town, and Boston Park was something he found satisfying and rewarding. Tim had immense pride in his role in the community and found comfort in his routine. But when cold and rainy October came, everything changed. One rainy night, as Tim was about to make his last routine drive after a thrilling baseball game, he was approached by two strange boys, each of them no more than 12. Cruising down his usual route, Tim spotted two young boys out in the rain. Huddled together and shivering, they looked to be about 10 and 12 years old. They were freezing and looked visibly upset. Glancing out his window, Tim saw the young boys freezing in the cold, their breaths forming puffs of clouds in the icy air. As fate would have it, the weather took a turn for the worse after the baseball game. With pleading eyes, they asked Tim if they could jump in the bus. The good-hearted bus driver, always aiming to help those in need, agreed and opened the door. As the rain poured down harder and daylight receded, the boys told him they lost their grandmother. They were afraid that she wouldn't be found in time. "Sorry to bother you, sir," the eldest said. "Can we get on your bus? We got separated from our grandma in the park, and it's freezing out here." His heart bled for them. "You can wait here until she finds you," Tim said with a friendly smile. Even though the boys weren't regular passengers or people he knew well, Tim's heart bled for them. He couldn't refuse them. "I hope your grandma finds you too soon. I'll wait with you until she does." Tim pulled over and opened the door, no hesitation whatsoever, and said, "Come sit here on these empty seats." He motioned for them to enter. "It's deathly cold out there." Thanking kind Tim profusely, the boys climbed aboard the bus. He didn't miss the fact that one of the boys shivered uncontrollably. Their noses were red and runny, their clothes drenched. Looking down, Tim noticed that the boy had Crocs on, the rain and ice seeping into his shoes. His heart sank. The boy wasn't dressed for this weather. Trying to make small talk with the children, Tim grew anxious as the minutes surpassed 10, and then 20. The bus was growing more occupied, and he had to get on the road soon. The young boys still waited for their granny, still shivering restlessly. He remembered that the younger boy wore Crocs and that the rain was seeping into his shoes. He thought to himself, "I can't leave them here." The boy accepted the towel Tim offered him, grateful for the chance to dry off. Thanking Tim, the boys quickly climbed in. They were drenched in rain and visibly upset. "What's the matter?" Tim asked, closing the door behind them. "We lost our granny," one of the boys said, trembling. "We were at a baseball game in the park, and we got separated." Tim looked at them with curiosity, wondering if they were being truthful. The kind bus driver tried to make small talk. "Hey, what's your name, little guy?" Tim asked, crouching down to the boy's level. He looked up with tears in his eyes, his mouth still messed with mustard and ketchup from the baseball game. The boy sniffled. "My name's Billy. And this is my brother, Tommy." Tim tried to comfort the boys. They must have been terrified all alone, and now their grandmother was nowhere to be seen. Tim felt a pang of sympathy for the boys. He knew that feeling of being lost and scared, and he wanted to help them. It wasn't the first time he had come across a lost child at the park, but their parents usually showed up after a couple of minutes. The boy's grandmother was taking unusually long to come through. "Don't worry," Tim said, trying to sound reassuring. "I'll help you find your grandmother." "What's her name? Do you know where she was last?" Tim's heart broke for the boys. Their grandmother didn't have a cell phone on her. He knew he had to do something. "All right, boys, I'm going to call the authorities and let them know you're here. They'll help us find your grandma, okay?" The boys nodded, and Tim dialed 911. He explained the situation to the dispatcher and asked for assistance. They assured him that help was on the way. After about 10 minutes, Tim began to grow anxious. The bus was filling up, and he needed to get on the road soon. There was no sign of the officers yet, and it was getting dark quickly. He checked on the boys and noticed that Tommy was still shivering. He took off his jacket and wrapped it around the boy, trying to warm him up. How long more would the authorities take to get there? Tim noticed the boys getting agitated. He He tried talking to them about their grandmother to find out where she could be. "Tommy, where did you last see your grandma?" Tim asked gently. Tommy sniffled again. She was sitting on a bench near the playground. She said she was tired and wanted to rest. A horrible thought crossed Tim's mind, but he didn't want to say it. Maybe their grandmother forgot about them. He made a decision to call the authorities and told them about the lost boys and asked if they could assist in finding their grandmother. He knew it was the right thing to do, but the officers were taking their time to get there. Tim was getting impatient because he would get into trouble with his transport company if he was late or if he dropped his passengers off past schedule. Would they arrive soon? Tim was about to log another call when he saw blue lights flashing in the distance. Just then, a police car pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out. They approached Tim and the boys, and one of them asked, "Are you the bus driver who called about the missing boys?" Tim nodded. "Yes, that's me. These are Billy and Tommy. They lost their grandma in the park." The officers came aboard to take statements from the boys. Would they be able to help? The officers exchanged a glance, and one of them said, "I'm sorry, sir, but we haven't received any reports of a missing grandmother. Are you sure they were with their grandma?" Tim's heart sank even further. "Yes, I'm sure. They were very upset and said they lost her." The officer quickly called back to headquarters to verify if what the boys were saying was true. The head office confirmed the address of their granny and sent dispatch to check if she was maybe at her residence. They confirmed that there wasn't anybody at home. She hadn't returned yet. The officers exchanged another glance, and one of them said, "We'll take the boys with us and see if we can locate their grandmother. Thank you for your help, sir." The boys were nervous, but Tim tried to reassure them. "Don't worry, we'll find her," he said. But the boys refused to leave the park without their grandmother. The officer made an announcement using his speaker, calling out for Penelope Merritt's, the boy's grandmother. Time passed, and more people came and left the park, but Penelope still didn't appear. Little Billy started to cry, and Tim's heart went out to him. Just then, an old woman came hobbling through the crowd, saying she was there. I'm here," she called. The boys were overjoyed, but when she wanted to take them, Thomas shook his head. He shunned the old woman and pushed her away, his face contorting into anger. Tommy, the elder boy, spoke up. "This is not our grandma," he said. The old woman looked confused and sad as she stood there. "Are you sure?" Officer Brown asked him. Both boys nodded their heads. "I don't know this lady," they said together. The officers were stunned. "What do we do now?" one of them asked. The officers discovered that the old lady that approached had dementia. She was also lost and looking for her family. It seemed as though the officers had a double missing persons case on their hands. Officer Martins escorted the old woman, named Lara, to the nearest station so they could find her family. In the meantime, the officers started asking people if they saw a lost old woman. Tim was nervous. He had 2 boys with him, and he didn't know what to do next. Another civilian approached the officers and said they thought they saw the old woman earlier. He had seen a woman matching Penelope's description earlier, sitting on a bench by herself. He had thought nothing of it at the time, but now he realized that she could be their grandmother. He told the officers to drive back to the opposite end of the park near the public restrooms. Would she still be there? The officers took the boys to identify the woman. They drove there to save time. Little Benny screamed out as they neared the bench. "There's grandma," he yelled out, pointing excitedly. He ran back to the bench, and sure enough, there she was. She was sitting there, looking lost and confused. "Penelope Merritt's?" Tim asked tentatively. Tim and the boys approached the lady slowly. She looked like she was sleeping or sick. He was unsure. The woman didn't hear him at first. She was lost in her own world. "Excuse me, madam," Officer Brown repeated. "Is that her?" he asked, pointing towards the old lady on the bench. Benny nodded his head. "Yes, that's her. She has dementia and sometimes can't remember us." The woman looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "Yes, that's me," she said. "Thank you for finding me." The boys ran towards their grandmother, hugging her tightly. Tim smiled. "No problem. Let's get you and your grandsons back home." The officers gathered the old lady together and seated her in the vehicle. They got a free ride home with the officers. As they walked back to the bus, Penelope explained what had happened. She had been sitting on the bench, waiting for her grandsons, when she had fallen asleep. When she woke up, they were gone, and she had been searching for them ever since. They seemed to have kept missing each other as they walked around the park. The boys were overjoyed to see their 80-year-old grandmother, and Tim was relieved that everything had turned out okay. The officers thanked him for his help and said that they would personally call his company to let them know about the delay. As he got back on the bus, Tim realized that this experience had flipped his life upside down. He had always been a kind man, but now he knew that he could make a difference in people's lives. As he drove off into the night, he couldn't help but feel nervous. Life was so unexpected, and he didn't know what the future held. He took Benny's cell phone number to check up on them every now and then. His heart was racing from the excitement of the search, but one thing was for sure: he was determined to make the most of it, and to help those in need whenever he could.